Does any of you think that you can make the case to Chinese leaders, Chinese people, that they need to accept significantly lower rates of growth in order to avoid some of the future problems that Linda was talking about? The estimates now are that the annual premature deaths from air pollution in China amount to 400,000. That's according to a study from the China's SEPA, the State Environmental Agency. When they see statistics like that, is it likely that you can then persuade them that if they grow at 2 percentage points or 3 percentage points less each year, that they can avoid some of these future costs? Do you see any sign that China is starting to look at the trade-offs of growth versus some of the future damage and the cleanup after the fact? Or are we still looking at primarily a growth-oriented model where new technologies come into the mix to try to make it just a little bit cleaner on the margins?
I think that in the U.S. and probably in China, the public understanding of the implications of environmental degradation provide a huge impetus to political change. Again, in the U.S., the Clean Water Act was passed after a river in Cleveland, Ohio caught on fire from pollution. It was a hugely motivating force on our Congress. I think the more the public understands, particularly if there are statistics from their own government, the implications of environmental pollution, the easier it will be to take the policies or the laws that are in place and put a lot more teeth behind them.
Yeah, I think public participation is going to be a huge driver, and I think the public health will be the driver because it affects people on a day-to-day basis when it comes to clean air and clean water. And I think, again, the economist's answer is, of course, these are all environmental externalities we're not internalizing, and somewhere we're paying for it. So maybe the growth figures look good for political reasons, but we're not accounting for all of the health cost and damages and incorporating those in the calculus of GDP not being the best measure of the quality of life of people. So I think the question of how you incorporate the environmental externalities into your measure of national wealth is what you're saying. So I don't know if it's bad of taking a lower GDP, but just at least acknowledging that the damage, especially focusing on the public health piece, is huge, and those costs should be considered in measuring how the economy is doing.
Well, Joe, you spent a lot of time in China. I'm hugely interested in your perspective.
There you go. Question back.
Turning the table on the questioner.
Well done.
Well, I think the environmentally progressive regulators in China argue actually quite strongly that they do need to very substantially reduce the rate of growth in order to begin to make this transition. Their sources of energy are extremely dirty, as we heard before, and much of the frothy investment-driven growth that we see in China is environmentally unfriendly. In other words, that marginal level, the portion that's over 9 or 10% is often duplicative, wasteful. Buildings or factories that are speculative in nature, that end up not being used efficiently or used at all, or that lead to kind of wasted investment dollars. And those things are all contributing to China's energy usage and environmental waste. So the SEPA agency has been trying very hard to persuade people in China that they do in fact need to accept significantly lower levels of GDP growth in return for an environmental payoff. But that has met pretty serious resistance at many levels of government, both in central ministries and at the local government level. Local governments are still primarily concerned with generating revenues locally and with meeting high GDP targets. And central ministries are, there's a bit of a silo situation. They are not responsible for enforcing environmental regulations or policies. They're responsible for generating power, for sort of expanding industry in the automobile sector, for example, generating revenue for the way they collect revenue, which is through taxes on their industry sector. So the structure of the Chinese government is not particularly friendly at the current time to enforcing broad notions of introducing these energy efficiency goals and environmental reductions. And in a sense, that's one of the reasons that people say we need a kind of a new environmentally friendly Deng Xiaoping to come and twist the system so that you have a new set of incentives that are broadly dispersed across the entire bureaucracy so that they can rally around this goal, because it won't happen by osmosis. And it may not happen by education either. It's not awareness per se. It's the core things that make people take the decisions that they take in a daily basis in the Chinese political system. So I think that would be my response to it. It doesn't mean it's impossible, because partly we're hearing this from people like Panlelists or others in senior ranks of the Chinese government who are trying very hard to change things. But so far, he is not prime minister, and he's unlikely to be anytime soon. So, there's a real debate on this very issue inside the Chinese bureaucracy.
Do we get a follow-up?
Sure.
It's another way of saying that there's a bubble, basically. The growth is not a real growth and not really adding much of value. And we always try to correct for growth that is not sustainable by higher interest rates and other mechanisms, and China is basically not willing to make adjustments to have the growth be really, more, not economically and environmentally more sustainable. I mean, is there a bubble? Is that what you're in effect saying?
Well, we heard a little bit about that from Hank Paulson at lunch today, from a slightly different perspective, which is the U.S. focus on China's trade surplus and on the value of its currency. It's part of the same macroeconomic picture. Chinese interest rates, by most economist standards, are relatively low. In fact, its savings rate is pathetically low relative to most developing or developed economies. If you put money in a Chinese bank today, you are earning less return in interest than the rate of inflation. So your money loses value in the banking system. Nonetheless, they have a savings rate which is the highest in the world. They have, in other words, a very unbalanced financial system. People do not have good places to put their money, and the state, through the banking system, gets access to that money, which is often channeled into investment projects favored by local officials, which are not entirely market-based in nature and somewhat wasteful. So there is an enormous and still ongoing macroeconomic adjustment which has yet to be completed in China, and until it's completed, some of these market-oriented environmental policies that have worked elsewhere are very difficult to introduce into the Chinese system. Gas prices is just one example of a place where China is still shooting itself in the foot to a certain extent, but it's very difficult to wean the economy off of subsidies of that sort and to start to move toward a much more market-based system. So these things are caught up in a broader adjustment of the political and economic system. They're not isolated.